Go for it.
Okay, I am happy to join you, although this is a strange way of doing it, remotely and sort of anonymously. But this is the curse we're living under right now, isn't it? So what I'll do here is I will offer you basically an excerpt from a book I have written together with the Zetkin Collective called White Skin, Black Fuel on the Danger of Fossil Fascism. And that's a very big book. It's nearly 600 pages. It's released by Verso in a couple of weeks. And we are looking at the relation between the far right and climate and energy. So we have looked at what the far right has been saying and doing about those things in 13 European countries and the US and Brazil in recent times. We haven't looked at Australia, nor Canada, and nor India, and many other places in the world are omitted, but we have had enough material to fill a book that's probably a bit too long already. So in the first part of the book, we look primarily at contemporary history, and in the second part of the book, we try to go deeper back into history and see how the articulation of race and energy, and more particularly white nationalism or white supremacy and fossil fuels emerged over time. And that brings us, of course, back to the 19th century when large-scale fossil fuel combustion took off under the auspices of the British Empire. And a key technology here was, of course, the steamboats. The steamboat was the first fossil fuel powered vehicle that the British Empire deployed on its various frontiers. The railroads came shortly after. And the steamboats were first used in warfare. But before 1840, steamboats had never been tested on the battlefield of a major war. It was in the summer of that year that the British Empire dispatched a first squadron to the coasts of Lebanon and Palestine. Tensions between the empire and Muhammad Ali were coming to a head. Nominally a pasha under the Ottomans, Muhammad Ali had used his power base in Egypt to carve out his own Arab empire, stretching all the way from Cairo to the doorsteps of Istanbul. Perhaps an even greater offense in the eyes of Britain was his campaign for building a modern manufacturing industry centered on cotton. The diplomatic machinery could not stand him. I quote, "For my own part, I hate Muhammad Ali, whom I consider as nothing but an arrogant barbarian," end quote, wrote Lord Palmerston, the mighty foreign secretary, in 1839. And he continued, "I look upon his boasted civilization of Egypt as the arrantest humbug," end quote. And London grew more belligerent by the month. "No," the consul general in Alexandria warned the Pasha, "it is in the power of England to pulverize you. Or we must strike at once rapidly and well." The ambassador in Istanbul sent home his advice, and then, quote again, "the whole tottering fabric of what is ridiculously called the Arab nationality will tumble to pieces," end quote. And with such words ringing through the corridors of Whitehall, the Royal Navy sent 4 shining new steamboats towards Beirut. Their commander, Charles Napier, stood on board the Gorgon, a vessel propelled by a 350 horsepower engine with room for 380 tons of coal, 1,600 soldiers, and 6 guns, the first true fighting steamship in history. And it was the coal that gave it propulsive force. Short on the fuel while reconnoitering the Levantine coast, Napier sent a call to several officers, quote, "You must send me coal vessels here at all costs, because steamers without coal are useless," end quote. The coal arrived, and on the 9th of September 1840, the bombardment of Beirut commenced. Much of the city was destroyed. Then Napier steered south and chased the Egyptian forces from one coastal fortress to another. "Steam," he reported back to London, "gives us a great superiority, and we shall keep them moving," end quote. Latakia, Trablus, Saida, Sur, Haifa fell like dominoes, the enemy retreating under the relentless, unpredictable attacks. Then Napier proceeded to the decisive battle at the Palestinian port town of Akka. The old Crusader capital of Akka had been garrisoned by the Egyptians with thousands of soldiers. The sturdiest fortress and main depot on the coast, it was also filled with ammunition. In early November, the 4 steamboats reached Akka, followed some days later by sailing ships that had been detained by weak winds. The fleet was arrayed in front of the town with the steamers in the center so as to make maximum use of their mobility. Massive shelling commenced, the Arabs returned the fire, but the steamboats constantly shifted their positions and easily evaded the shells. And then suddenly, a deafening detonation ripped through the battlefield. Like a volcano eruption, a column of smoke and debris rose from within Akka. One testimony read afterwards, "The smoke rested for a few moments like an immense black dome obscuring everything." End quote. One of the steamboats had hit the Great Powder magazine, and correspondence between the British commanders in the archives suggests that they were aware of its position and had planned to target it. The explosion concluded the battle. I quote, "2 entire regiments were annihilated and every living creature within the area of 60,000 square yards ceased to exist, the loss of life being variously computed from 1,200 to 2,000 persons." This according to one dispatch to Lord Palmerston. And when the British soldiers entered Akka, they were greeted by utter devastation. I quote again, "Corpses of men, women, and children, blackened by the explosion of the magazine and mutilated in the most horrid manner by the cannon shot, lay everywhere about, half buried among the ruins of the homes and fortifications. Women were searching for the bodies of their husbands, children for their fathers." End quote. An officer from one of the steamers described seeing hands, arms, and toes sticking out of the rubble. In a letter to his wife, Napier himself expressed unease, quote, "I went on shore at Acre," that's Akka, "to see the havoc we had occasioned and witness a sight that never can be effaced from my memory and makes me at this time even almost shudder to think of it." End quote. Not a single man on the 4 steamboats was killed or wounded. Another resource, however, was exhausted in the action, and that was coal. When silence fell over the body-strewn beaches, none of the steamers had more than 1 day's supply on board, nearly all of their coal having been burnt in the pulverization of Akka. The battle ended the war in one fell stroke. Muhammad Ali surrendered completely. His empire and cotton industry collapsed. In 1841, the success was repeated in the more famous First Opium War, in which another squadron of steamboats priced open China for trade. And after these victories, the Observer printed an homage to steam, I read. "In the Chinese waters, as well as on the coast of Syria, the employment of steam has produced results which astonished mankind. In the extreme west of Asia, as well as in the extreme east, in China and in Palestine, it has finished wars which under former circumstances might have been protracted to infinity. But even these achievements, great and important as they are, do not seem to bear any proportion to those which are still possible to that wondrous power. Steam, even now, almost realizes the idea of military omnipotence and military omnipresence. It is everywhere, and there is no withstanding it." End quote. The Mechanics magazine was even more excited. I quote, "Let war come to a conflict of steam engines, and all the barbarian rabble of the world, Turks and Tartars, Arabs, Indians, Africans, and Chinese, must obviously be out of the question at once." End quote. Up until the second quarter of the 19th century, the British Empire was built with wind. Colonies, bases, naval battles, and blockades were won by means of sailing ships. Yet for all its supremacy on the seas, the metropolis encountered limits on precisely this count. The reliance on wind restricted the latitude of power. Sailing upstream on rivers was a slow and arduous task, if possible at all. So imperial stations were generally located on shorelines or islands in the nature of 2 holes. On the subcontinent, in China, the Levant, West Africa, and Latin America, the wind-dependent empire mostly had to stay on the margins, unable to penetrate interiors. Steamboats promised to take it straight into the hearts of those dark continents. Wind belonged to the flow of energy, coursing through the landscape, shifting in time from one moment of storm to another of calm, often too feeble to carry a ship against the current. The stock would set the waterborne empire free from such restrictions. Taken out of the repositories of energy from the very distant past, belonging neither to the landscape nor the weather in which the boats operated, coal allowed captains to go against the wind and the tide, this fuel was entirely in the hands of its masters. But the rotative steam engine that could propel vehicles, such as boats, required more than coal from the mines of Britain. A steam engine was built of various metal parts rubbing against each other. This produced friction, and so the owner had to apply oil. Unless regularly lubricated, the engine would break down. From where, then, did the British owners of steam engines get their oil? They got it from the Niger Delta. By far, the most important lubricant in early 19th century British industry was palm oil, almost exclusively imported from West Africa, predominantly the banks of the river Niger, where nuts from palm trees were turned into oil through a burdensome process performed by women. Animal fats were neither sufficient nor suitable, whereas palm oil was perfect for lubricating not only steam engines, but also railway carriages, spinning mules, and other machines. And were it not for all that oil, those machines would have literally come to a standstill. As the adoption of steam power and the mechanization of British industry advanced in leaps and bounds in the second quarter of the 19th century, the importation of palm oil exploded. From 1807, the year when the empire officially prohibited the slave trade, to the 1840s, the annual quantity ferried to Britain increased by a factor of more than 200. Like all seagoing commerce up to that point, this trade was conducted by wind. British merchants had to dock at trading posts on the mouth of the Niger and wait for native partners to come down with the goods. The local kingdoms resisted foreign penetration, and as long as they had to trust to the wind, the British had no physical or mechanical weapon to overcome them. Instead, they were forced to deal with the middlemen and brokers, backed up by autonomous chiefs and kings who delivered the palm oil as and when they saw fit. When demand increased, this system turned into a source of deep frustration. British traders complained ever louder about the natives obstructing the trade, slowing it down, sometimes suspending it entirely. But the solution to this embarrassing predicament came fortuitously in the shape of the steam engine itself. With its power, the merchants could pierce through the delta, bypass the coastal states, reach the producers directly, and pour the palm oil freely into their vessels. The brothers Richard and John Lander, the first British explorers to map the course of the Niger in 1830, laid out the vision, I quote, "The first effect of a trade being opened will be to do away with the monopoly near the mouth of the river, which has hitherto been held by the chiefs of the lower countries. Steamboats will penetrate up the river and will defy the efforts of these monopolists to arrest their progress. The steam engine, the grandest invention of the human mind, will be a fit means of conveying civilization among these uninformed Africans who, incapable of comprehending such a thing, will view its arrival among them with astonishment and terror." Unquote. The first steam-powered expedition set out in 1832 under the leadership of the shipper MacGregor Laird. 2 boats drove up the river. Naturally, the residents of the Delta were not happy about it. In a casual tone, Laird narrated how they took shots at his boats. In one rebellious area, he wrote, quote, "We agreed to land and burn the town as an example to the rest," end quote. And such scenes were repeated throughout the expedition. During one ambush, massive casualties were inflicted on the sailors. One of those killed was a Swede. The expedition ended in disaster, with most of the crewmen perishing in engagements or disease. But Laird had, in fact, demonstrated that the Niger and its riches were accessible by steamboats. He ended his 2-volume account of the events with a manifesto for what might be called steam or stock imperialism. "We have a power," he wrote, "we have a power bequeathed to us by the immortal Watt. By his invention, every river is laid open to us, time and distance are shortened. This power, which has only been in existence for a quarter of a century, has rendered rivers truly the highway of nations and made easy what it would have been difficult, if not impossible, to accomplish without it. We are the chief repository of it. Our mineral wealth," that's a reference to the coal reserves of Britain, "our mineral wealth and the mechanical habits of our people give us a superiority over all others." End quote. It's the privilege of bourgeois visionaries to be able to see their visions come true only by swimming with the tide of history. In the early 1850s, Laird's company established the first regular steamship service between Britain and the Niger Delta. Soon his boats were plying up and down the Niger and back and forth between the West African coast and the metropolis. And the result was a second, even more marvelous explosion in the palm oil trade. Similar outflows were set off from Egypt, whose lands were converted to the production of raw cotton for British mills, the once prospering Egyptian mills derelict after the Battle of Akka, accounting for more than half of supplies imported by the metropolis from 1848 onwards. The trade route between Egypt and Britain was among the first to shift to steam. Driving up and down the Nile, steamboats picked up bales of raw cotton and carried them to Alexandria, whence they were shipped home. Meanwhile, Egypt underwent the most extreme deindustrialization anywhere in the 19th century. But the fates of the peoples of the Nile and the Niger were all too representative. Across the seven seas, the peripheries of the capitalist economy were bound in the position of suppliers of raw materials to the core. That division of labor had, of course, been under construction for some time, but the 19th century was, quote, a period of exceptionally rapid divergence between core and periphery, and that divergence was most dramatic over the half century 1820 to 1870, end quote. This being an observation made by Geoffrey G. Williamson in Trade and Poverty when the Third World fell behind. And in passing, Williamson also notices that peoples in the southern parts of the planet were not thrilled about submitting to imperial trade, but, quote, the naval muscle of the industrial leaders made them comply, end quote. And those muscles were nourished by a fossil fuel, namely coal. Now, what we focus on in the rest of the chapter I'm drawing on here in this book is the effects these developments had on whiteness and on racism. And I will just, so on the level of ideology, that is, I will just briefly outline the argument we're making here. Before the 19th century, white people who lay claim to superiority tended to invoke religion. So early enslavement of Africans, for example, was justified with the curse of Ham, this interpretation of a passage in Genesis where Ham happens upon his father Noah without clothes and is punished with a curse. And black people, the assumed descendants of Ham, would have to pay for his crime, seeing the father naked by forever being slaves. But over the course of the 19th century, whiteness was placed on an apparently firmer footing. In Machines as the Measure of Men, Science, Technology, and Ideologies of Western Dominance, Michael Andreas has documented the shift to another gauge of human worth. People who mastered nature stood above those who did not. So the argument went, for instance, it would never occur to Africans to push aside large stones that blocked the path. Indians venerated cows. On the dark continents, people lived in thatched huts surrounded by wild animals at the mercy of unmanaged, untapped, unmastered nature. Europeans alone had cracked her secret codes and yoked her power to machines. Now it was their material achievements that set them off from all others, who were perceived as residues from earlier stages of evolution. Essentially inhabiting another time, primitive peoples were the stunted children of mankind, so immature that they bowed down to the forces of nature and let them go to waste. So they deserved to be ruled. Europeans had a higher mandate to govern them, not given by God so much as by technology, which supplanted other criteria and solidified into the insignia of superiority. And only then, after centuries of fluctuations, Adas contends, did the category of race and whiteness come to a kind of rest. So now it was the industrious whites above all others. And the inferiors, crucially, now included the Middle East and China, previously held in some esteem for their arts and monuments of civilization. But after the wars of the early 1840s, they were relegated to the inferior non-whites of the world, conclusively so. And at the turn of the century, a near total intellectual consensus, trickling down to lower classes in the metropolis, through travel accounts, adventure novels, the penny press, interpreted the near total European dominance of the world as the manifestation of a racial character unrivaled in excellence. So we argue that modern racism is unthinkable without techno-racism. And no technological complex was as pivotal as this one, the steamboats, and then the railroad cars and all the other steam-powered machines of white Europe. And travelers boarded them on triumphal processions through the colonies and sent home word of the shock and awe. And we offer quite a few examples of this kind of ideology in the 19th century British Empire. I'm just going to give one before I wrap up. And that is from John Turnbull Thomson, who was a fairly average engineer, explorer, and superintendent employed by various branches of imperial administration in Asia, acceding to the post of Surveyor General of New Zealand in 1856. In a lecture 2 decades later, he recalled how the South Island had been in what he called a state of wilderness when he arrived. Since then, the railway system had made rapid strides, along with foundries producing steam engines and machinery for coal mines. Progress for him had a sign in the sky. I quote, "The tall chimneys everywhere rising indicate that in this part of the world, all the skilled trades have found a suitable and ever-increasing location," end quote. And painting on a broader canvas, Thomson then retraced the advances of steam across America and Asia from the Mississippi to the Yangtze, before returning home to retell an anecdote about a Maori girl killed, cooked, and eaten, quote, by her own race. Was this not the shadow of coming events, an allegory of the certain fate of so inhuman a race? End quote. Likewise, he argued, the red-collared man has been swept off the face of the northern continent of America, end quote. And after serving this global theater of violence, Thomson reached his punchline. Then, what has made the white man, or more conspicuously the Anglo-Saxon, of the Teutonic race so ubiquitously progressive and aggressive? This more especially of so recent a date, it is his humanity and science combined with steam, and what makes steam for him, it is coal. What then has coal to do with our race? As far as we know yet, everything. And the argument we're making here is that large-scale fossil fuel combustion was articulated to a racist ideology from the very beginning through the deployment of steam power in the British Empire. And that if we want to understand the far right today as the most aggressive defender of business as usual and of continued and indeed expanded production of fossil fuels, and this is the pattern that we observe in Europe, in countries like Germany, Poland, Norway, many others, in the US and in Brazil, and I think you recognize this from the Australian context as well. We need to go back to the historical origins of this articulation, and that is, of course, located in the 19th century British Empire. Our argument in this book isn't really that steam power and thereby coal was absolutely vital to imperialist expansion in the 19th century, but I personally believe it was. And I have an intention to write a book called Fossil Empire at some point to demonstrate this. But that's far in the future. It's something that we can, of course, discuss. And clearly, this sort of argument has several different implications for historical understandings of the problem of the climate crisis itself, including the notorious Anthropocene narrative and its idea that it's humanity as a whole that has brought us into this mess. The global expansion and diffusion of fossil fuel combustion in the 19th century occurred through the vector of violence from the colonial center and inflicted on the peripheries. There was never any human consensus or voluntary adoption from people in the Niger Delta or in Egypt or indeed anywhere else of this kind of technology. It was imposed on people by force and most obviously in the form of steam-powered warfare. Yeah, I will end there, and I thank you for listening.